So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, whatever time of day it is, wherever everybody is, and welcome to the session. Let me introduce myself. I am Barbara Schreiner. I am the Executive Director of the Water Integrity Network, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session on what is the opening day of the 2021 World Water Week. I would like to welcome our excellent speakers who I will introduce in more detail in due course. Suffice to say that I think we have an excellent lineup for this afternoon, and I think it's going to be a very interesting session. 2 weeks ago, the International Panel on Climate Change released a report which indicates unprecedented climate change across the globe. The report should frighten all of us. The actions required to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees or even under 2 degrees are massive and urgent. The report projects that in the coming decades, there will be increasing climate effects, increasing heat waves, greater flooding, more intense droughts, changes in rainfall patterns, and the very real possibility in many areas of reaching the tolerance levels for agriculture and health. Many of the climate chaos impacts play out in the water sector. And while the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions remains absolutely critical, we must also focus very strongly on the issue of adaptation to climate change. Adaptation to climate change is an immense undertaking, requiring massive investment. Unfortunately, wherever large sums of money are changing hands, the potential for corruption has to be considered. For every $100 billion mobilized each year for multilateral climate finance, of which about a 13% share is allotted to water projects, around $1 to $2 billion may be lost to corruption. That's every year, according to a World Bank estimate. That's a lot of money to lose in the climate change adaptation field. But it is only one aspect of the potential impacts of corruption in the climate adaptation sector. Of equal, if not more concern, is the question as to whether corruption in the climate adaptation sector may, in fact, result in projects that fail to address adaptation effectively, or even worse, result in maladaptation, leaving affected groups more vulnerable to climate change than prior to the intervention. This is because corruption has the potential to influence the selection of projects and adaptation responses, selecting those that give most payback to developers rather than those that truly protect vulnerable populations. Sadly, many areas needing climate adaptation are at high risk of corruption and integrity failures, and the results often impact hardest on the most vulnerable, on marginalized communities, and within those communities on women and children, people living with disabilities, and the elderly. But improving integrity and institutionalizing anti-corruption measures that can limit maladaptation are possible. In this session, Tackling Corruption and Integrity Failures in Water Sector Climate Adaptation, we will explore the cost of integrity failures and maladaptation, present cases where corruption occurred, discuss how integrity measures are being and can be taken to improve the effective use of climate adaptation funds. To discuss this, we have with us in this session, Dr. Catherine Vincent, Ms. Reni Valadares-Alcero, and Mr. Ibrahim Pan. I will introduce each of them in more detail when it's their turn to speak. But before we go into the first presentation, a short note on logistics. We do have some time for questions in this session, although as in all of these sessions, limited time, never enough time, as much time as we would like to have. If you put your questions into the chat box, we will try either to answer them in the chat box or to pose some of them to the speakers in the Q&A session. I can't guarantee that we'll get through all of them, but we'll do our best. And on that note, I'd like to introduce the first speaker. The first speaker we have is Dr. Catherine Vincent. She's the Director of Kulima Integrated Development Solutions in South Africa, and she holds visiting research positions at the Universities of KwaZulu-Natal and Leeds and the Center for Climate Change Economics and Policy. Her expertise is in the social dimensions of climate change, especially vulnerability, adaptation, and institutions and governance. Kulima Integrated Development Solutions is a specialist climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction consultancy with experience across Africa and beyond. Their expertise is centered around climate change adaptation and includes the related fields of vulnerability, climate finance, and disaster risk reduction. They're also committed to taking gender-sensitive approaches to their projects. Catherine is the co-author of a paper called Adaptation Interventions and Their Effect on Vulnerability in Developing Countries, Help, Hindrance, or Irrelevance, which was published in the World Development Journal in May this year. And that's the topic on which she's going to be talking to us about today. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see that okay. Right, so it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you about maladaptation, the unintended consequences of inappropriate and poor climate adaptation intervention design. And as Barbara said, I'm going to be speaking based on the findings from this paper in World Development, which is a collaboration among lots of authors and seems to have found resonance in lots of corners of the world since. So it's nice to be able to talk about that today. So why is this important? Of course, we don't need to be convinced of this. The first reason is that we know that there are significant adaptation needs. As Barbara has said, last week, the IPCC Working Group 1 report has been published. Working Group 2 will follow shortly, and then Working Group 3 and Working Group 2 will tell us a lot more about the specifics of adaptation. But this graph here on the left just shows the adaptation, the estimates of different adaptation costs from different sources. What we can see, of course, is that they are significant. And again, we know that the amount of resources already available for financing adaptation is significant. So here we've got bubbles representing the relative size of different climate finance funds. We can see there that the Green Climate Fund comes up very significantly. So the author team of this paper, we realized, of course, that there's a significant need for adaptation and that a lot of resources are being ploughed into it, but there's not really that many systematic attempts to look at the effectiveness of the way in which these resources are used. So that's what we were intending to do. So I had a look at how Transparency International defines corruption, and they say it's the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Of course, if we're talking about integrity failures in general, then that casts the net even wider. But I think this is a really important point, because if we analyze the power relations that underline the way in which we carry out adaptation, typically through projects, which undergo a particular process of identification for funding, then implementation, then evaluation, we soon see that there's lots of scope and many dimensions through which power relations can skew the distribution of benefits. And of course, often this is not intentional. Certainly when I hear the word corruption, I think about intentional diversion of funds, but it can be much more varied than that, and often is not at all intentional. It's just a function of the way we do things and the way that we've designed particularly the adaptation project cycle. And I think that's really important. That's why we want to highlight it, because if we're aware of it, then of course we're going to be much better placed to do something about it. So in this particular paper, we reviewed 34 different sources of evidence, and we found basically that 3 different clusters of things are happening in adaptation interventions. The first one is that we're seeing situations where vulnerability is being reinforced, which obviously is not what we want. We want to see vulnerability being reduced. And there are various reasons behind this. Sometimes it's as a result of donor utility being prioritized to ensure that there's rapid success of a project, working somewhere where you know, for example, because that's where you're going to find the quick wins, possibly working in the most accessible areas because they're the easiest to get to, again, for the quick wins. But of course, the consequences of this is that those resources are not going to address the needs of the most vulnerable people, and sometimes even the most vulnerable places. We also have circumstances where elite capture is leading to reinforced vulnerability, where the benefits of the adaptation are being captured by specific groups of the population, typically those who are not the most vulnerable. And that, again, also tends to happen kind of through design. And to give one water example that we found that fell into this category of reinforcing vulnerability, in Colombia, in an intervention designed to support adaptation to water scarcity, the funding was over distributed to the regions that were least affected by that water scarcity, and the distribution was related more to the political connections than the actual need. So that's the first example, first cluster of examples that we saw. The second one we saw is where vulnerability is redistributed as a result of adaptation intervention. So here you have off-site effects, and these are quite common, I think, with water-related projects. As we can imagine, if we're creating a dam, for example, that is going to have off-site effects elsewhere, and if those are not considered, then there's a chance that you're redistributing vulnerability from one place to another. And we see this with flood embankments, with polders, lots of water-related examples, basically, which means we need to kind of cast the net a bit wider when we're looking at the potential implications to ensure that this doesn't happen. And then the third cluster that we came across in the literature was the creation of new vulnerability, where one adaptation intervention was perhaps addressing one source of vulnerability, but creating a new one. So this could be creating new vulnerabilities spatially in places that perhaps weren't vulnerable in the past, or it could be creating new vulnerabilities amongst groups of people that perhaps weren't vulnerable in the past. So lots of activities. We found evidence of creating path dependencies, which may lead to situations of vulnerability in the future. These are primary examples of maladaptation. And these are often related, of course, to hard infrastructure, which has a long lifespan, because it then creates a situation where people are more likely to have to rely on a new way of doing things, which may not be sustainable in the context of a changing climate. Other examples of creating new vulnerabilities we came across were things like introducing new systems and ways of operating that perhaps undermined local ways of doing, when actually those local ways were perhaps more adaptive overall. So why does this happen? Well, several reasons why this happens. One would be an insufficient understanding of context. I think it's long been known within the adaptation literature and kind of dating back to social critiques of natural hazards, that we really need to understand the nature of vulnerability in order to tackle it. And sometimes if we have a very technocratic approach that doesn't consider the context and the underlying sources of vulnerability, then that just ends up reinforcing a particular situation. But of course, it takes time and money to understand context, and we don't always have that. And I think, again, the way in which we work through adaptation projects at the moment is perhaps not conducive to providing a good opportunity to understand those contexts to be able to design an intervention effectively. Another reason that this happens is inequitable participation, and this is partly related to poor understanding of context. We often have kind of project planning and management that's very top-down, so it does end up relying on existing networks, and of course those networks can reinforce particular power relations and lead to some voices being excluded and other voices being over-prioritized. So that's definitely another major reason for this issue arising. A third one that we saw coming up quite a lot was this idea of retrofitting adaptation. So I'm sure we can all think of examples where this has happened, where there's rebranding of a development initiative, often with the motivation of accessing climate finance, because climate finance is significant. And in those cases, the understanding of social vulnerability and the understanding of future climate risk and how that will affect vulnerability is not always taken into account. And so in those retrofitting examples, you increase the likelihood that you haven't really understood the context and the nature of climate risk. So again, you run the risk of this situation of change vulnerability. And then last but not least, we found that adaptation success is typically defined by dominant development agendas and is not well informed by local contexts. And again, I'm sure we've all heard examples of where there's a kind of implicit understanding of what adaptation is, what success looks like, but no one's actually kind of sat down and thought about it as relevant to a particular context. So that comes up quite significantly. And of course, if we have that, if that understanding is underlining the way in which projects are designed and implemented and crucially monitored and evaluated, then again, we have issues arising there. But then, of course, the key question, and this is why I hope we can, of course, continue in the discussion today as well, is how can we stop this? What do we need to do to kind of change this situation? Well, I think the first thing to note here is that adaptation, of course, is a process. It's not a blueprint solution. And anytime we're trying to take one particular adaptation example, which may have worked very effectively in one place, if we unproblematically try and just think we can put it somewhere else and it will be as effective, then we're likely to run into problems. And if we take this process-based approach, that opens up the opportunity to understanding the dynamics of what's creating vulnerability in the first place, and also gives us the opportunity to reassess the nature of that vulnerability after interventions. So adaptation as a longer-term process and not a blueprint solution. Another way we can stop it, of course, is a better awareness of power relations and how and why and where they play out and what the implications of that are for our activities. Again, this is not always easy to do. It does take time and effort, but there are ways in which we can do it. And it's important that we do it if we want to be more effective with our adaptation and avoid situations where vulnerability is reinforced and maladaptations are brought about. Thirdly, I think we need to be really careful in having blinkered approaches to projects. I mean, the reality is that a lot of adaptation is done through projects, but projects can be dangerous. They can encourage us to cast our gaze very specifically at a particular location or on particular groups of people, and we sometimes forget the broader context. So we do need to be very careful of that. And that's kind of on a spatial basis, but also on a temporal basis. You know, there's lots of successful projects which have taken place and the learning from those projects is not ever taken forward. So we end up repeating mistakes and redoing things inefficiently because we haven't looked at that more temporally. So I think we can be more nuanced and more critical with the way that we use projects to implement adaptation. And then last but not least of these suggestions, at least, is we need to think more carefully about what successful adaptation looks like as related to a particular scale and context. And if we make that very, then we have far more likelihood of success and far more likelihood of preventing maladaptation. I'll leave it there because I'd like to leave us lots of time for discussion, but thank you for your attention. Back to you, Barbara.
Catherine, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking and somewhat disturbing presentation. It raises a lot of challenges. We know there are challenges in climate change adaptation anyway because of the uncertainty around climate change, but clearly other challenges. But thank you for ending on a constructive note in terms of there are things that we can do better in terms of addressing that. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Reni Valadares-Alcero, who is a lawyer by training with a focus on trade. She graduated from the Universidad Tecnológica Centroamericano and has a postgraduate degree in international trade management from the Centro Universitario Villanueva, attached to the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Excuse my pronunciation, please, Reni, and any other Spanish speakers out there. She was part of the corporate finance team and the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, CABI's Border Zone Development Program in Central America. She's an internationally certified anti-money laundering specialist and is currently the chief of CABI's Integrity and Compliance Office, leading the process of implementation and administration of CABI's integrity system. The CABI Integrity and Compliance Office ensures that the institution complies with all applicable laws, regulations, and policies regarding money laundering and terrorism financing, and to preserve the integrity and reputation of the bank. She'll be talking to us about the CABI experience in tackling corruption and integrity cases. Rennie, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just let me know if you see the presentation.
Lou, you probably have to make yourself visible on the video, otherwise probably the presentation might not appear.
So while the presentation is being presented, I am also a certified fraud examiner and a certified sanctions specialist. Have more than 13 years of experience at Cabay, being a part of the project procurement and risk management team, and now interim head of the Integrity and Compliance Office. So I see that you see the presentation. So part of the presentation experience that I wanted to show and present is all constructed from Cabay's experiences of what we've seen along the years and how we should tackle all of corruption and integrity. And if we can move forward to the next slide, please. Next, please.
Sorry, guys, we seem to be having some technical challenges here.
Can you move to the previous one, please, to the first one? Thank you. There it is. So now, it's really important to understand that projects are inherently risky. So things are going to happen. You have to expect, so you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. So it's really important to acknowledge from the start that the problems exist. You have to anticipate. Everything that has to do from your project planning, from your procurement, your supervision, your monitoring, your oversight, you have to take into consideration the project risks. You can't enter in any type of project without taking this into consideration. So one of the first and most important thing is that you have to take a knowledge from the start that the problem exists. We talk about corruption, we talk about prohibited practices, we talk about maladaptation, how vulnerable we are. So the first and foremost step of your teams, or all the teams that are part of the project planning, is inherently the risk exists. So prepare and acknowledge from the start that the problem exists. So anticipate your risks. Next. So sometimes we find ourselves building a plane as we fly. So there is where many of the risk arises. So it's really important, and it's simple. We have to identify the risk and have a multidisciplinary team working in all the aspects and basic aspects of the project planning. Analyze how that uncertainty of things or the outcome of things can take place. Take into consideration the impact. Your goal objectives have to be really clear. You have to have a strategic action plan and put together all that plan and take action. It's really important to understand that sometimes we see the consequences, but we have not, first and foremost, acknowledged the risk, and knowing that we have to have all in plan to take into consideration that we cannot build the plane as we fly. Next, please. Solutions from our perspective have to be simple. in many of the cases, since we put on action plans, I per se had action plans that took 12, 20 or more steps. And what increases in the people who working for the projects and that are already affected, that the project outcome can have a significant adverse effect on the population and not a benefit for development. So you have to have the ability to recognize and build and make those ideas, simple controls, to take into consideration that your project will need help. It's really important that if you know that you have to risk address that project, that you take into consideration all of this project risk management analysis, and that you have to stick to the basics. To every problem, there is a most simple solution. So that has to be something that has to be always in your mind. Sometimes we end up pushing and piling so many things for our teams, and it ends up being a huge or humongous problem that the integrity, that the compliance offices are part of. We have to be part of the solution. Let's move ahead. It's really important that the multidisciplinary teams are part of it. Your environmental, your sustainable team, if it has to do with likelihood, if it has to do with everything from a procurement perspective, from a strategic perspective, from a project financing perspective, you have to make them engage, be part of the project planning, be part of the risk management, be part of the solution. It's really important. It doesn't matter if it's a $1,000 operation or $1 million operation or 100 million operations, because what you have to seek is that the outcome of that project, of that planning, and if it has to do with water sanitation, takes into consideration that we are benefiting populations. So it's really important to have all those proper analysis, and that your teams help out in all of the consecution of the operation. Create shared responsibility and accountability. It's super important. So that we can address all these adverse outcomes and consequences, raise the awareness, have in place best practices, engage with the leaders is super important. Rethink the model that one size fits all. I think that Catherine already mentioned that, and we have to actually rethink that one model fits all, and have all that comprehensive networks and actors from local and national authorities. We work around with public and private authorities in the project zone to solve the problem that exists. It's really important to have that from the start. And for last, I think that all these times, even the COVID pandemic and everything that we've seen, and as Barbara mentioned, we have to adapt. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Rennie, and sorry about some of the technological glitches there, but I think the message came across very clearly. And I keep thinking that we're dealing with corruption risk, we're dealing with climate risk, we've got like risk squared here that we're trying to deal with. And it doesn't make it easy, but it certainly makes it interesting. Our third and last speaker today is Ibrahim Pam, who is the head of the Green Climate Fund's Independent Integrity Unit. He previously worked as an analyst and investigator in the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, and then as chief investigator in the Integrity and Anti-Corruption Department of the African Development Bank. As a delegate, Ibrahim participated in the drafting of the African Union Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption, as well as of the UN Convention Against Corruption. He also assisted in developing the general principles for review of investigative officers of the Conference of International Investigators. Most recently, he was resident investigator at the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services for the UN mission in South Sudan. He holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Jos and a Master in Criminal Justice Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. The Independent Integrity Unit, or the IIU, investigates allegations of fraud, corruption, misconduct, and other prohibited practices. These include coercive and collusive practices, abuse, conflict of interest, and retaliation against whistleblowers, a critical issue. The IIU also takes a preventative approach by establishing integrity policies and guidelines and recommending improvements to existing GCF policies and procedures. And he's going to be talking to us on the role of the financier in mitigating integrity failures and maladaptation. Ibrahim, the floor is yours, or the screen perhaps. And you're on mute.
Thank you, Barbara. I always do this. It's a pleasure and a privilege to again be on this platform and to share with you and with the audience the work of the Independent Integrity Unit of the Green Climate Fund in preventing the misuse of GCF resources. I'll share my presentation. And hopefully you can see it.
We can see it, just put it on full screen, on presentation mode.
Got that.
Perfect.
Okay, so the topic that I'm presenting on is the role of the financier in mitigating integrity failures and maladaptation. Just to start with sort of an overview of what the GCF does. The Green Climate Fund, as you know, is the world's largest climate fund mandated to support developing countries to raise and realize their nationally determined contributions, ambitions towards low emissions, climate resilient pathways. The fund is an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. Now, what this slide presents is the total value of GCF financing at $33.2 billion in 177 projects in 197 countries. And the result areas are as set out, and health, food, and water security is the result area that is most interesting to us for the purpose of this presentation. Let me also share some statistics on adaptation projects at the GCF. This is as at August 2021. There are 74 adaptation projects, which make up 41.8% of the GCF total portfolio, with a total dollar value of $1.86 billion, benefiting potentially 273.4 million people. A few more statistics. The adaptation projects, specifically in the water security result area, 64 projects with a total commitment of $825.2 million in 75 countries, potentially benefiting 188.29 million beneficiaries. At the last board meeting at B28, there were 3 water security adaptation projects approved. One in Micronesia, a multi-country project for Comoros, Mauritius, Madagascar, and Seychelles, and a project in Jordan. Just gives you an idea of the commitment of the GCF towards water security, adaptation water security projects. These are the steps that we take to mitigate integrity failures and maladaptation. At the Independent Integrity Unit, we seek to build a policy framework that enables all stakeholders to adopt policies and standards to integrate integrity safeguards. We integrate these policies into all of our operations and legal agreements. We monitor the implementation of projects. We investigate reactively if there are complaints. We enforce by applying sanctions, but overall we seek to collaborate and build networks of integrity. So I'll take each one of them. In building the safeguards and a policy framework, we have worked in 4 main areas: prevention, detection, investigation, and mediation. We've built out our policies with applying policies on ethics and conflicts of interest, an AML-CFT policy, which is anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, a policy on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, a policy on the protection of whistleblowers and witnesses, and the administrative remedies and exclusions policy, which sets out the sanctions for breaches. And in integrating these policies, we include them in our legal agreements. And this photograph shows the executive director of the GCF signing a legal agreement in company of General Counsel and the Director of Mitigation and Adaptation. We monitor the performance of projects through an integrity due diligence platform. We also conduct proactive integrity reviews on projects, and we have developed a data analytics capability which enables us to exploit big data in order to detect integrity violations. Of course, the investigation function, as I said, is reactive, and we have a set of standards and a manual that guides the application of the integrity of the investigation function. And then we've got the digital forensics and data analytics capability as well to support that. In terms of enforcement, we have a set of sanctions, and in view of the overriding interest to ensure that we do not adversely affect the execution of projects, we've chosen a base sanction of a non-debarment sanction which promotes compliance. In terms of our collaborations, we have built a network of integrity across entities that work with the GCF. And at the COP25, we established what we call the Madrid Alliance, which brings together entities to agree on common standards. And of course, we also issue advisories on policy.
Ibrahim,
I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss.
1 minute.
Thank you, Barbara, and happy to have a further discussion during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Great. I didn't know how many slides you had left at that point. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to our 3 presenters for some very interesting and very diverse presentations coming to this issue from very different angles that I hope will stimulate some interesting discussion. As I said to people at the beginning, if you want to put questions in the chat box, we will try to get to them, but I do have some questions to the panelists myself. And I think, Ibrahim, hot on the heels of your presentation, I'll start with you. The Green Climate Fund isn't really in the business of designing projects and programs. You are in the business of receiving applications and funding them. So what could you see as mechanisms for the Green Climate Fund to ensure that maladaptation is actually minimized in the programs that are presented to you by partners, by accredited entities, or whoever it is the recipients of your grant? What do you see as the role of the Green Climate Fund there, and particularly taking into account some of the stuff that Catherine has raised about even with the best intentions, things go a bit pear-shaped?
Thank you, Barbara, and indeed, thanks, Catherine, for the work that you've done that brings out some of these issues. What the Green Climate Fund does is that we have an independent technical assessment panel that looks at all of our projects and their design and And this is an independent panel made of external members. And what they're looking for is to ensure that the projects are designed to achieve the outcomes that the GCF seeks. They're looking to ensure that some of the issues around whether it's elite capture, whether it's the specifics about the locations of projects or how they impact on beneficiaries, etc., are all properly, they ensure that these are properly addressed and the projects are not retrofitted, adaptation projects, but they're actually designed to achieve concrete outcomes. Having said that, even before that, we have a division of mitigation and adaptation with specialists in all sectors, including the water sector, and they essentially work with the project originators to build in safeguards in terms of the quality of the projects. And of course, the board does scrutinize this carefully, with also the effective participation of civil society during the considerations. So there are a number of eyes that are on the projects in their design, in their conception, but also in the development. And sometimes projects have conditions attached to them before the board approves further on. Of course, what we do at the Integrity Unit is then to monitor the projects, but also there's a unit in the Secretariat that does project monitoring as well. What we're looking to do is we're looking on the integrity side to be sure that procurement rules are properly observed and all of the safeguards, including the influence of politically exposed persons. We're constantly checking to be sure that our projects. Now, what are the outcomes of all of our efforts? I think our projects are currently in a state of maturity where we will begin to see what these outcomes are. But we have an evaluation unit which has done an overall evaluation of GCF adaptation projects, and they released a report in February, a 238-page report, which summarizes the impact thus far of GCF adaptation projects, and the indicators are positive. So we do have a number of approaches, right from project development right through to project implementation and then impact evaluation at the end of it to address this very important question.
Thanks very much for that, Ibrahim. I would love to hear the discussion between yourself and Catherine over a bottle of wine when we had much more time to actually explore some of the challenges and the. I mean, you've clearly got a lot in place, but there's no way that you can guarantee that things are going to be 100% successful. But there's clearly still an ongoing conversation. And we're all learning in this process. Rennie, if I can turn to you for a moment, I'd be interested in your term of office with CABI. What have you noticed about trends around corruption and integrity failures and how they manifest in climate financing and in relation to maladaptation? In particular, do you have any examples that come to mind around the water sector? And what is it that makes climate financing particularly vulnerable to the issues of corruption and integrity failures?
Thank you very much. Yes, there's some trends that specifically has to do with the procurement. We see the same companies over and over again working for the same projects. So we have to address all those procurement failures from when we develop the terms of reference specifically. Are we, it may be prohibited practices taking in place, then why are the same companies working around the same projects? And that suppose a centralized risk because they manage to have all those projects in place. And so all of those prohibited practices that take place like in a specific country are going to take place in like from my side, we've had the same company awarded for water sanitation operations in 3 countries, and so we had to move around and see what was happening. Do the tenders actually were reviewed? Did the technical aspects were reviewed adequately? Why aren't we having other companies? Why are we transferring this risk to other countries? And we see from the Quebec side, we work a lot with private and public sector, and we see many, as Ibrahim mentioned, political exposed persons working around in these operations. We see a lack of resources heading for civil society being part of addressing the issues of the projects, accompanying, having all those factors is really important for mitigating integrity risks. Is for me, procurement, having civil society really engaged, having a technical and a proper tender is fundamental, and also the risk management of your project. If there's no much resources, keep it simple, but always go ahead and forward. Take into consideration that the risk exists. I think in no part of the world it's exempt from prohibited practices nor corruption. So taking that into consideration, construct your work plan around it.
Great, thank you very much for that indeed. And yes, the reference to participation and civil society, a very interesting one, because they play a critical role in many ways in relation to this. And that takes me rather nicely into my question for Catherine. Catherine, in your paper, you talk about transformative adaptation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what transformative adaptation is, and whether you think that it is a better way to reduce the risk of maladaptation. And within that, how can those people those communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change be better engaged to ensure that the adaptation activities don't actually further exacerbate their vulnerabilities or create new vulnerabilities or redistribute vulnerabilities, whether it's arising from intentional or unintentional things, but how can that consultation, that participation take place in the framework of transformative adaptation?
Great question, thank you. I mean, the incremental adaptation that we are mainly seeing, I think, it's almost like a sticking plaster approach, and it's taking place against the kind of dominant paradigm that we're working in, which determines whose knowledge counts and what a desirable future looks like. But with transformative adaptation, it's getting us to question that very paradigm within which we're working. So it does provide the opportunity to identify and address the root causes that are giving rise to differential vulnerability in the first place, and which in turn cascade through and can give rise to these situations where we see the vulnerability being reinforced or redistributed or created in new circumstances. But of course, that makes it much harder to do, and particularly makes it very hard to do within the context of projects, because if we want transformative change, we're looking at system change, and not just on a limited kind of spatial area or over a limited time period. In terms of better engaging people, I mean, I think all the funding agencies at the moment are pretty good about encouraging some kind of local engagement, but there's lots of continua that kind of talk about the different types of engagement that we can have at community level, from at the very superficial level, being informed of something, through to being consulted, being involved, and then at a deeper level where communities are actually driving the agendas themselves. And I think often we end up a little bit at the shallow level of that. And again, it's not necessarily intentional, it's sometimes just circumstantial. Time and money is limited, so you do what's the easiest to do. You contact the people who are easiest to engage with, which is usually the local elites, those that are better educated, those that can converse well in English or Spanish or French, or the dominant language, which may not be the first language of all people. So I think if we pay more attention to that engagement process and try and make it deeper, I think that would be helpful. But we have to remember, of course, that that might mean shifting the whole way we think about projects, because if we have an idea in mind and then we go and consult on it, that idea may not be appropriate to that community context. But if you go with a kind of a blank piece of paper and actually co-explore issues and kind of co-produce an agenda for adaptation, it might be different to what you had in mind, but it's much more likely to be locally owned and to be addressing some of those root causes of vulnerability. I think one of the other things which is important to bear in mind is that there's a large kind of research community that's involved in looking at a lot of these issues, and we could better, I think, in terms of like project design, I think we could better engage with researchers who have deeper connections perhaps at community level and could help to broker some of these conversations and could bring to light some of the learnings. Just another thing that I would like to reflect on is last week one of my colleagues was looking at some of the adaptation projects taking place in one African country. She found 58 projects, but the number which were either recently completed or currently ongoing, but less than 10% of those had an evaluation that was publicly available. Okay, not all of them have finished yet, but that should be much higher because we should be able to learn from what's gone in the past, moving on into the future. And that doesn't happen too much either. And I think that also gives rise to a greater risk of maladaptation.
Great. Thank you very much for that. We have a question from Ben Brown, and I don't know who wants to respond to this. How can anti-corruption measures be communicated during the implementation of adaptation projects and foster a culture of community monitoring or whistleblowing where people feel safe and empowered to speak out? In other words, how can trust and legitimacy be secured? I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer a response to that one. Rini?
Yeah, definitely. It depends on the type of project, but you can go from having a robust system, a web system who allows you to present anonymously the allegations. All of the multilateral development banks, including GCF, obligates when we have this type of projects that we have a whistleblowing protection policy for whistleblowers. Catherine mentioned something that's really important, is that all stages of the project have to be public. All stages of the project, and that means that if you're assessing an integrity risk, you can have also from small aspects as placing a box. We've had operations in which you don't even have, you have to drive there 8 hours, 9 hours just to get to the most near village. And so having and putting in place, analyzing what the population, the beneficiaries of that operation have access to. So if they don't have access to internet to place an allegation in your webpage system in the form of anonymously, so make ahead and plan ahead that your supervision and your monitoring team has to collect information from that beneficiaries each time that they follow up the project, and how from an integrity office perspective you're going to ask them each time they have to present that final documentation if they led to the opportunity for people of the community to present an allegation anonymously, take into consideration. So it's really important. And most of us have worked hard on policies for not allowing discrimination or retaliation given the presenting of allegations.
Thank you very much for that, Rini. There are a number of questions now coming through from the floor, and unfortunately, we have limited time. But I think one of the questions is around the whole issue of participation and scale. And I think it's something that's coming through in this discussion. It's easy to do really intense participation at the local scale, but when you're dealing with a much bigger project, how do you bridge that? How do you make sure that the really disadvantaged voices are the ones that are actually consulted? And I don't know if there's anybody who wants to comment briefly on that one. And then I have one other question that I want to follow up with. Catherine, go for it.
Sorry, Ibrahim, I jumped in front of you. I think commitment to doing that, I think, is really important and counts for a lot. If there's a constant awareness of the need to be questioning throughout and never kind of resting on your laurels, I think that's really important. I also think it's really important to have a constructive kind of approach to monitoring and evaluation, so that all parties that are involved in the implementation are aware that monitoring and evaluation is not just to check that you've done what you said you were going to do, but it's an opportunity to learn to be able to do things better. So, you know, you have lots of people involved in implementation of projects who are the eyes and ears. They can be looking out for cases of marginalization that, you know, may not, in an earlier stage of the project, that may not come up at all, but if it arises, to see it, to act upon it very proactively, I think is really key. But I think it's to do with having a constructive culture for monitoring and evaluation, and ensuring that everyone involved in implementing the project is thinking about how to do these things all the time. On the question of scale, this is constantly a difficult one, but this is where, again, I think learning about good approaches and making sure that they're applied, and making sure that we have temporal learning from what went previously can at least increase the efficiencies a little bit.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. I saw you nodding, and I think you have something you would like to add to that. But I would also like you, when you're answering that, to also answer the question of what do you think the next steps might be for us to better understand the links between corruption, integrity failures, and maladaptation? How do we take this discussion forward? So maybe if you can quickly address those two issues.
Yes, thanks, Barbara. So the whole GCF business model is built around very strong accountability, and thank you, Catherine, for expounding on some of those elements. But the entire approach is to ensure, from the very conception and development of the project, we've got the involvement of independent experts, of civil society. We hear the voices of the communities come through. We also have ensure that we have a strong environmental and social safeguards approach. These are all enshrined, including the rights of indigenous people, labor rights, etc. Everything that we try to do with the project is to ensure that it not only achieves the project aims, but does so in a way that brings maximum social and social benefits, and creates, you know, the value that we're looking for, not just in terms of the technical outcomes, but also in terms of, you know, ensuring that there's integrity in the way that we execute our projects. That's really core for the GCF in building confidence to ensure that we continue to execute projects that are meaningful.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. I think on that note, we're going to have to close the session before the session automatically closes on us. These things are timed. There's no way that you can hog the room and keep your competitors out a little bit longer. So in closing, let me say thank you very much to the three presenters. It has been a very interesting discussion, as I say, coming from very different aspects. And I think for me, it's the start of a discussion that we need to take a lot further, is what is this relationship between maladaptation, vulnerability, and corruption, integrity failures. And I look forward to taking it forward. In that regard, let me say that the Water Integrity Network is working with the Green Climate Fund and others on developing an issue paper, a policy brief for COP26. And if there are any other organizations out there that would like to be part of it in some way, please just contact us at WIN, and we can see how to incorporate you into that process. I think that's going to be quite interesting. Clearly, climate change adaptation, a critical issue facing us. As we saw from the first presentation, some big dots out there, of which the Green Climate Fund is one. A lot of money in this area, and a lot of need to make sure that we can improve integrity, improve participation, accountability, and transparency, to make sure that we really, really do put in place the activities and the interventions that are critical to actually put in place proper climate adaptation. So I would just like to say in conclusion, and also in honor or remembrance of those people who have lost their lives and livelihoods to climate change already, whether it's been through floods or fires or droughts, we have to address this issue of adaptation to climate change urgently and with integrity and with passion. The lives of people actually depend on it. On that note, thank you very much to everybody and enjoy the rest of World Water Week. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rennie, Catherine, Ibrahim. I think it was very interesting.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to the internet for no technical glitches.
Indeed, indeed.
We must have another conversation, Catherine, I think.
Yes, definitely. I'd be very keen to continue to be involved in these discussions. I mean, I think it's so important. We all recognise that working collectively, we can all do much better here with significant implications for those that are missing out at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. We will definitely take this conversation forward.
We would have been better off with an hour and a half, I think.
Always too much. Yeah, always too much to discuss for the time available.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Ibrahim, please go and get some sleep. Rennie, enjoy your day.
All right.
Bye.
And thank you,
Thanks,
Philip.
everybody. Bye.
Thanks very much, and hopefully we can meet in person
And goodbye
soon.
to the participants who are
Yes.
still with us. Cheers.
Thank you, Gopal,
Thank you.
for the question.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.